Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on safeguarding. I know there's a number of people still joining, but aware that we've got, as usual, a packed agenda. So I'm just going to run through housekeeping as people join. So please can we ask you to remember to mute your lines and turn your videos off until you're asking any questions or entering into any of the discussions. If you can, raise your hand to let us know that you want to ask a question or give some feedback if you have this function. If not, also share your comments, questions, reflections in the chat function box. Please do put in the chat. We're really keen to know who we've got on the webinar today, and obviously we've invited safeguarding leads as well. So if you could just put a quick message in the box as to who you are and what organisation you're joining from today, that would be lovely. And just to remind everybody that we're recording the webinar for those that are not able to join this morning so that they can watch it at a later date. So if you have any issues with it being recorded, then our suggestion would be that you don't switch your camera on or ask a question. Okay. Next slide, please. So first of all, introductions. I'm Liz Cullen, Head of Clinical Programme for Maternity and Perinatal Mental Health for Hampshire Thames Valley. Since back in March, I've been working across the Southeast during COVID period. We're lucky enough to have another great agenda with some fantastic speakers. So obviously the focus of today is safeguarding. I'm going to give a quick national update in a second, just a brief one today. And then we will move on to domestic abuse, which Police Sergeant Debbie Ashthorpe is going to give to us. And then we've got a stalking presentation from Claire from the Suzy Lampley Trust. And then Pete is going to join us to talk about mother's intrusive thoughts. All of which are great presentations, so I think we will have a good morning. Now, obviously, we will stick to time as best we can in order to keep things on track. So just for speakers, so that you know, Jenny or myself will switch on our camera about 2 minutes before the end of your slot so that you know in terms of timing. Okay. Without further ado, we'll move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so a very quick national update from myself today. Next slide, please. So really just to update people around the maternal mental health services bids. So most importantly is that the outcome of the bid process is currently embargoed by the national team. So we held the bid review panels on the 8th of October. That was a panel from across the region, representation from both maternity, perinatal mental health, public health, local authority, service user representation, quite a large panel. And then what we have done is we have updated each of the services, the systems that put in their bid have had initial feedback. So that was done last Wednesday and yesterday. So systems themselves know whether they have been successful or not. But that information is currently embargoed, so I cannot share yet who within our region has been successful. For the systems, they will also, or you will also be receiving a follow-up letter by next Monday, just talking through next steps, etc. That will follow. Next slide, please. So, what we're expecting is there will be a national announcement in early November once all the sites nationally have been confirmed. And that announcement will obviously lift the embargo. So sorry, I'm aware that there's a lot of beeping with all the messages coming through. Thank you. That should that should stop, so it won't annoy you guys. Yeah, details of successful sites will be announced in November once the embargo is lifted. Up until that point, obviously, anybody who has been involved in your bid, you can inform, but there should be no external comms at this stage. We will provide further detail. A date of embargo will be lifted, and there will also be some comms materials that will be coming from the national team, and that we will also be doing regionally as well, so we'll share them. Despite the embargo, the funding is still planned to flow in Q3, so we're expecting the funding to be coming down very, very shortly, and in the feedback that we've given to systems, they are aware of that. Okay, so that's as much information as I can share currently with regards to maternal mental health services. Next slide, please. And the other thing I wanted to update you all about today is the Health Education England Perinatal Mental Health Regional Training Fund for this financial year. So we've been lucky enough in the last few years to have received regional funding in order to upskill our specialist teams, but wider across the workforce for perinatal mental health, and there's a fund again this year in order for us to do that. So the aim is to address known gaps in education and training, and there's been £1 million nationally, of which the South East has a pot of £131,000 that we are bidding for. So I know that probably some people have had some conversations in terms of, we've been asking people if they had anything that they wish to be included. We are planning to put in, we're in the process of developing a Southeast bid so that we can look at both economies of scale, but looking at what is needed in terms of training provision across the whole of Southeast. But there have been requests that have gone out to individual systems to ask them if they have specific things that they want included. So if you have any suggestions of any training or training support you would like us to consider, please either put it in the chat box or get in touch with us directly following today's webinar, and we will make sure that those are considered and included. 131,000 sounds a lot, but actually in order to cover the whole of the South, it isn't a great deal, but it will still be, it's still fantastic that we have at least that pot of money and we can do some good work with that. So the closing date for bids is next week, and then we should hear sometime in November, so we will keep you updated with that, but please do put your comments in the chat box. Okay, that's it for me. I'm going to hand over to Jenny, and Jenny will do introductions.
Good morning, everybody. I'm really delighted to introduce Debbie Ashthorpe to you all. We're obviously, as you know, we're focusing on safeguarding today, and Debbie is going to give us the police perspective. Debbie isn't able to use the camera on her laptop because that's a police thing. So you will see the slides and hear her, but you sadly won't be able to see her. But so welcome to Debbie, and thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us today.
Hi. You okay? Good morning. Hi, my name's Debbie Ashthorpe. Thank you very much for having me. I know I've only got 15 minutes, so I'm going to take you, I think, on a pretty fast tour of lots of stuff around domestic abuse, certainly from a policing perspective, which I hope is informative. Can I just check, Jenny, that everyone can hear me?
Yeah, I'm hearing
Yes.
you loud and clear, so I'm speaking for everyone. And can I just take a quick reminder for everyone to mute themselves, because I'm hearing something which I think is somebody that's not muted. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. So yes, I'm a Hampshire police officer, so I'm going to keep the information I give as general as possible. I appreciate people are listening from a wide area. At the end of this, I've put some national but also some Hampshire specific support details, so hopefully that will be sufficient for everybody. We've had a huge amount of training in the police in the last 2 years. after a report back in 2016 which said we didn't do it well enough. I'm going to be referring to some of those things today, and you know, we have this vision that wouldn't it be fantastic if we could all talk the same language. So to put it into context, 1 in 4 women will experience domestic abuse, and that statistic has actually stayed pretty static for about 20 years now. We think as on the average time for somebody to make a disclosure is about 2.5 years. That rises for people who have additional difficulties. So somebody with a disability, for example, will live with domestic abuse for longer because of the complexity of the nature of that domestic abuse. They will live with that for longer before they disclose and try and seek help. The last one I want to tell you about really, and this is something I want to touch on today, is that 1 in 7 children will grow up in a household with domestic abuse in their childhood. Now, if domestic abuse is a hidden crime, then children who are experiencing domestic abuse truly are hidden victims, and that's something which I really hope that will come across loud and clear today. Next slide, please. So domestic abuse, this is the national the cross-government definition, so if I let people read that and I'll just talk over it. I think it's very clear that we know what physical abuse looks like, and we know a black eye, a bruise, etc. We understand what that is. But the one I really want to draw out today is controlling coercive behaviour. There's another phrase for this which is often used, and I don't know if people have heard it, and it is intimate terrorism. It's basically the complete control of a person in the relationship from one person over the other. One person holds all the control, seeks to gain control over the other person, and there will generally be some kind of fear that they gain that control by. Often it's fear of violence, but we can see relationships where there's no actual violence ever being used, but their fear of violence is there, or some kind of fear of something else, a secret being told, or something else which is behind their ability to maintain control. Often perpetrators of controlling coercive behaviour have very rigid belief systems and expectations within a relationship, and because of that actually will have a sense of being very justified in what they do. It's very clear that in relationships where there's controlling coercive behaviour, there will be rules in the relationship which are set by one person, which the other person must abide by or face the consequences. Quite often those rules change when the perpetrator wants them to. So it can be very, very difficult to detect coercive controlling behaviour, much more difficult than something physical which you can see. So our training in the police, and this is what a message I wanted to get across today, was that because it's so much more difficult to detect, that there's a greater need for people to be on the lookout for it. And I will give you some tips on how we do it, and I hope that you'll find some of that help when you speak to people as well. So what we're looking for is a substantial adverse effect. For us to consider what is controlling coercive behaviour, we're looking for substantial adverse effect on a victim's day-to-day usual activities. So that would be things like stopping or changing the way they look, stop the way they socialise, the amount of time they can spend with family, friends. And particularly, I think we're under COVID, somebody's ability to control somebody has actually potentially increased. It could be things like changes of routine at home. Meal times can be particularly traumatic in a controlling coercive behaviour relationship, or who does the jobs, who does the household chores, and if they don't do them, what are the consequences? You could be finding that there is a difference in the way somebody attends at work, so their attendance record, work or school, or they might change their route to work. Victims might themselves have already put into place measures at home to protect themselves and their children. But what you're going to find long term is physical and or mental health deterioration. Next slide, please. Thank you. So yes, I think during lockdown, it's very clear that reported domestic abuse to police is nationally, and I can absolutely say that for Hampshire, went down. So we know that there were fewer reports coming in. So what we found steadily, as we've worked quite hard really to sort of allow people to have access to help and find ways to actually seek support, we're now finding that our reported domestic abuse is back up to the 2019 levels. I think today's webinar is fantastic timing, because actually as we're looking at the impact of potentially more lockdowns happening, it's really good that we actually understand this. You know, if somebody has got the chance to seek help, that this could be the moment, and actually this is the right time for us to engage with them. So I think COVID, yes, has probably increased the isolation and lack of access. The thing I really wanted to bring out was the bottom two there, the increase in online domestic abuse, sort of cyber enabled and stalking type behaviours. We know there's been more reported incidents of that to police, but also romance fraud. Now, I don't know if that's a concept which is familiar to people here, but there's been a steady rise in romance fraud. It's basically when somebody will make a fake profile on a dating website and seek to gain a relationship, albeit online or on text or some kind of device, where they form a relationship with somebody and tell them very, very quickly they love them, they think they're wonderful. They've never actually met this person. But over time, they manage to get money out of people, and it could be for excuses like, I can't get out of the country, I need a visa, can you help me with this, money's got stuck, can you provide me with money? Now we know that this is massively increased. So there was something like from the year 19 to 20, there was a 20% increase in reported romance fraud. And at the moment, they estimate the average of that nationally to be £66 million, and each victim having given over about £10,000. So where dating websites were getting very good at finding out fraudulent people who were perpetrating this type of crime, they're very good at blocking those and taking those profiles down. So what we're finding now is that people are using other means. So lots of people now are trying to use online gaming platforms, so betting platforms, but also direct contact via social media. So they'll scan across social media and just contact hundreds of people. So we know this is dramatically underreported, but the impact on people, it clearly is hugely financial. Victims will honestly believe they are in a relationship with somebody that they have never met. So if you, I suppose for me, what I want to say is please keep that in the back of your mind. Has the person in front of you actually met the person who is they are in a relationship with? And if not, what was that about? Prosecutions are incredibly difficult with romance fraud because perpetrators remain largely undetected, largely because it's being perpetrated from abroad. So actually what we need to do is to spot it, try and stop it, disrupt it. There is an action fraud helpline number and a website, and I'll supply that at the end, which would be the first point of call for somebody who is suffering this, or of course you could make a report to police. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I think it's very clear domestic abuse has very significant long-lasting impacts on victims, and obviously I've listed them there. So the point I wanted to make to bring out around this is that with all of these impact dynamics going on within a family, this is the context with which victims are living, but with which they're bringing up their children as well. So actually, as a result, children are suffering the impact that the victims are suffering, which under COVID we believe is even deeper. So for me, what I want to say is if domestic abuse is hidden, then so are the children who are growing up in those houses. Next slide, please. Thank you. When domestic abuse occurs in pregnancy, and quite often domestic abuse will start in pregnancy because attention moves towards the baby, and a woman will focus more clearly on pregnancy, and then difficulties will arise with somebody where domestic abuse. So sometimes in relationships where there's been no domestic abuse, it can start in pregnancy. If it's already started, then it will likely increase. And we know from studies now that the impact on unborn babies is massive. There's a growing body of science which will show impacts around smaller brain sizes, developmental problems, behavioural problems, and health issues with children who have suffered trauma while the mother was pregnant, and particularly related to domestic abuse. Yeah, the new DA bill, which is going through Parliament, which has obviously been going through for quite a long time, seeks to recognise children as victims in their own right. At the moment, when we get a report of domestic abuse, we don't record children as victims on our systems, but the new DA bill is seeking to do that. So children who are present when domestic abuse happens or grow up in families where that's happening will be recognised in their own right. I put a clip there to a TED talk by Nadine Burke-Harris, who's a fantastic doctor from America, absolutely brilliant, and it talks about ACEs and trauma and what happens to children who grow up with significant trauma happening in their life. So I absolutely recommend that to you. Shame we don't have time to watch it now. Next slide, please. So in older children, you're going to see an impact. We know there's a large variety of responses in children. You could go from a child who is going from the perfect child to the child who is presenting challenging behaviour, and are clearly the ones I've listed there. What you can say, though, is that behaviour is going to mirror what is happening with the parents at home, or what is happening in that dynamic in that family. So I guess what I'd be saying is look for behaviour that's different to normal and ask why. We absolutely know fact that children cannot cope with domestic abuse. It will come out in behaviour, which could actually be quite extreme. Children display high levels of fear towards abuse, and they will adapt their behaviours accordingly. Younger children might act out and be more challenging. Attainment might fall. They might be tired, sad, confused. But I think older children who are starting to not be in the house because they don't want to be in the house, they leave the house, or start not spending time at school or at home. We know from studies under our violent crime reduction work in Hampshire there's a high correlation between domestic abuse and children who are exposed and vulnerable to gangs and criminality. The one I really want to mention on there as well, specifically, is eating disorders. Meal times for victims of domestic abuse and families experiencing domestic abuse can be a time of huge stress. So where difficulties will arise because a perpetrator will say, this is not the meal I wanted, this is not how I wanted it to be, and children and families will know that's their complete stress point within their family. So if you're looking at people who are developing not eating, what is that about? So asking that question, why is this happening to that child? Next slide, please. Find out more. So the training we've done, but this applies to everybody, of course. Show you notice and show that you care. And clearly the interactions which there's the people on this call today, you're all in a caring environment and speaking to people. So I think it's where COVID has potentially eroded trust between victims and professionals or anybody else. It's building that in a safe environment if you possibly can. Creating a sense of safety. This person is safe with you. This person is safe to talk to you and able to talk to you. And we have a phrase, professional curiosity. So that is, if something is itching away at you, ask the question, ask it. And if you if you uncover something, then the form for you to actually get that in, that can raise that concern, is the dash form, and submit that into the MASH. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is a list of questions which we use in the police when we say, right, we've got our normal questions and we've got our dash questions, and we've got things like what's happened, how's this happened, who's done this. But actually, here's a different way of asking questions which allows somebody in an open and unchallenging way to be able to reflect a little bit and perhaps see their life slightly differently. So clearly I won't go through all of them, but I wanted them to be on here for you so that you could actually think about how could I use some of these questions to ask somebody a question in a completely non-challenging way. What's a typical day like for you? Can you tell me what things your husband, wife, or your partner expects you to do? Because asking these questions will allow somebody potentially to open up and talk to you about some controlling behaviour that might be happening in their life. It certainly won't cause any harm. We ask officers to pick one of these questions and make sure they absolutely always ask it. And sometimes it's about having that question up your sleeve which you're most comfortable about asking. But I wanted to give you a selection of them so that you could just decide which ones suited yourselves. Next slide, please. So what can you expect from the police? If you are somewhere and you something is happening in front of you right now, clearly urgent, ring 999. We absolutely respond to incidents of harm and risk that are happening now. I suppose that's very clear. It's the less obvious stuff, isn't it, that's more difficult. If you've got concerns that are not urgent, then clearly following your own safeguarding processes for children and victims. But the point for victims of domestic abuse is going to be getting your concerns in via the dash form. So your dash form will go to the MASH, the Multi-Agency Safeguarding Hub, where it will be assessed. So I wanted to sort of just explain that if you have a high number of yes answers to the dash form because you've got people who are answering questions and they're giving you information and you're getting a lot of information which causes you concern, then it was going to be graded high. A high grading on a dash form will mean that it will go forward for a MARIC. So that's a meeting which will happen between professionals around what are we going to do to protect this person and this family. But I think the point I want to make to you today as well is that it's hugely important that your professional judgment, you don't have to have 14 yes answers on a dash form in order for this to go to MARIC or for this to be flagged as high risk. Your professional judgment alone, those things, that sense you have that something is terribly wrong, can trigger a MARIC and get people around the table and talking about what is happening for somebody so that actions can then follow on. Your dash forms or any incident involving a child will go to the school the next day under Op Compass, so if police have been attended an incident the night before, the schools will know by 9 o'clock the next morning that that child has been through a traumatic incident the night before. We ask schools to make sure that they have eyes on that child, to make sure they're okay, and to ask them to understand what's going on for them. Next slide, please. I know I'm running low on time, I'm really sorry. The last thing, a couple of points I wanted to make, I've put in a couple of slides around safety questions, because safety planning and making people feel safe or think about their own safety is vital. If they were to be referred to a domestic abuse charity or to a commissioned service, they would be going through safety questions with them. So I wanted to put some of that across to you. So here's some examples of questions. I want to bring out if you believe that if somebody's being stalked on their phone, camera, Alexa, or anything in the house which could possibly have some kind of tracking device on it, it is absolutely vital that that person gets expert advice in terms of how to deal with that issue. And there will be specialists who are within the domestic abuse services who can give advice about that. The police can as well. It's absolutely vital that we don't just strip that away immediately, because that puts the person at great risk. The last point at the bottom there, I put on there, victims will be experts of their perpetrator. That's a big generalisation, but they will, if they're in a domestic abuse situation, they will have learnt to manage their perpetrator, and they will also understand how fearful they are around what risk that perpetrator can pose to them. So it's about us understanding how fearful is the person and how capable is the perpetrator, and putting those two things together actually gives us a picture of how at risk somebody is. So yes, how scared they are is a very good indicator. Next, please. Safety plan. This is something which the domestic abuse charities would be doing with somebody. If somebody engages with a domestic abuse charity, and I would absolutely suggest that would be vital for them to do that, they will be going through some of these actions with them around what can we do for this person to make them safe, to make them feel safe, and what support can we provide. I won't read through all of them. The one I like a lot is have a code word or a sign if you're in danger. So if somebody is able to speak to a relative, a friend, and they to alert them that they call the police now, a code word could be quite a good idea. Again, teach that to age appropriate children if you can. Right, I'm on my last one. Last two slides. Next slide, please. So there's some national support, so a couple of national helplines for you. Also, I wanted to put on there the Safe Lives website. They've got some fantastic training resources on there which are free. They also offer clearly bespoke training which you can pay for, but there's an awful lot of advice and guidance on that website, specifically on that link. And my last slide, please. this is some Hampshire stuff. If there's people listening from Hampshire, there is a 24-hour helpline for anybody to call. That's you, me, victims, anybody, 24 hours. It's been confirmed until January, but I think it's March. And underneath that, I've put a lot of Hampshire services as well. Thank you very much for listening.
Wow. Thank you so much. If anybody's got questions, could you stick them in the chat box? And Debbie, are you okay to answer them via the chat box? Are you staying around for a little while?
Yes, yep, I can do that, definitely.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Just because of time, I think we'll do it today, and then we can move on and sort of fit everybody in. But thank you again. That was amazing, and I've learnt so much from that I just have to have a think about some aspects of that talk that is new to me, and I'm sure that's probably played out across our audience today. So thank you. So moving on, and in a seamless segue, we're moving on to stalking. So we're delighted to have Claire Alcombe-Webber from the Suzy Lampley Trust to talk about stalking. So I shall now hand over to Claire. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Actually, that works beautifully following on from Debbie's talk, because a lot of the things, particularly safety planning, that Debbie was talking about, works perfectly well for victims of stalking as well. So I'll give you a little introduction to myself and the trust, and then I'm going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what stalking is, what the impacts of stalking are, and what victims of stalking need and how you can assist them. But like I said, an awful lot of what Debbie said is relevant for victims of stalking as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the crossover between domestic abuse and coercive control and stalking, so that you can sort of work out how things fit together from that point of view. So I've been the manager of our national services for about 3.5 years at the Suzy Lampley Trust, and before that my professional life was in domestic abuse services, both in commissioning and frontline services as well. So I've been in this world for 20 odd years now. This is all I've ever done. So can I have the next slide, please? So for those of you who don't know, and it always just depends on who the audience is, I'd like to give a little bit of a background to who Suzy Lampley was. So Suzy was an estate agent who disappeared when she was 25. She went out to show a client, Mr. Kipp, around an empty property, and she didn't return. So she disappeared and was declared dead in 1993. The reason that the trust was set up initially was because Suzy disappeared at lunchtime and she wasn't reported missing until 6:45 at night. And the police indicated at the time that that significant delay really could have potentially cost Suzy's life, that there weren't safety procedures in place for estate agents going out on these sorts of calls, and that had she been reported missing sooner, there could have been opportunities to find her. So can I have the next slide, please? So Diana and Paul Lampley set up the trust in 1986 after her disappearance, and really their initial campaigning goals were around pioneering personal safety as a life skill and a public policy priority. And the reason why we started working around stalking quite soon after that is because there was some quite strong evidence that Suzy herself was stalked by her abductor prior to the attack. So this sort of joint work around both personal safety at work and in the rest of people's lives, but also specifically looking at stalking, is something that we've been doing now for 30 odd years. So we have 3 sort of strands to the work that we do. We do a lot of campaigning work. So that includes the National Stalking Consortium and campaigns such as National Stalking Awareness Week. We've done an awful lot about bringing in and changing legislation across the years and trying to really make sure that at a policy level things are set up to keep people safe. We also do an awful lot of direct training, so what I'm doing today, but we run open access courses around stalking. We do things right from very introductory stalking training courses right through to teaching people how to now become specialist psychological stalking advocates, working with people to help them sort of recover from the mental health impacts of stalking. And we do direct support for victims as well. So we run the National Stalking Helpline, which has now been running for 10 years. And we have advocacy services as well, which I'll tell you a bit more about later on. So can I have the next slide, please? So like I said, we've done an awful lot around legislation. And as far as we know, we're the largest stalking advice and advocacy service in the world, which gives us, you know, a couple of different hats, really. We have a great amount of data at our disposal. So we do an awful lot of research around the impact of stalking on victims, what they need, how we can best support them, how the criminal justice service can best serve them. And it also means that, you know, we're always trying to innovate and evolve our services and make sure that they're really meeting people's needs. So can I have the next slide? Oh, sorry, I've had some odd ones have jumped in here. Can we skip ahead 2 slides? So apologies, this is what happens when we're all working remotely and our central server doesn't work particularly well. If you just click a couple of times, we'll get the bottom bit of this. Thank you, Sarah. So I wanted to give you just a few stats around stalking. So there is a sort of a misconception that stalking is serious, but it doesn't happen very often. When you talk about stalking to people, quite often they think about celebrities, they think about strangers lurking in bushes. That sort of stereotypical idea of stalking isn't something that's borne out with the people that we deal with. So the England Wales Crime Survey last year found that there were nearly 1.5 million individuals living across England and Wales who were stalked last year, and it's very similar in its prevalence to domestic abuse. So we see about 1 in 5 women and about 1 in 10 men across their lifetime will experience stalking. So can I have the next slide, please? And what we see actually is that, like I said, that idea of stranger stalking. Can you just click one more time, Sarah, so I get the next bit up as well? Thanks. That idea that strangers are the people who are stalkers is very much untrue from the people that we talk to. Half of the people who contact our service are being stalked by an ex-partner. Another 3% are being stalked by a family member. Almost everybody who contacts us knows the person who's stalking them. It's only about 6% are being stalked by a true stranger. So this is where the crossover with domestic abuse really comes in, is though that's sort of 55% who are ex-partners we're dealing with. Can I have the next slide, please? And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about stalking behaviour. So again, you know, that sort of stereotype of stalking, someone following you, they're lurking in the bushes. It's very much the physical stalking behaviours that people think about, when actually what we see is very much, you know, like Debbie was talking about, online behaviours are incredibly prevalent, and this is something that has increased this year with the pandemic and with lockdown, you know, where people have been perhaps less able to be out and about. Both, you know, victims haven't been out and about, but perpetrators to a certain extent as well have been curtailed. So the vast majority of our clients experience some form of online or digital stalking, whether that's on social media, whether that's emails, text messages, phone calls, those sorts of things. What we find from research with stalkers is that it's easy. Basically, they know that online stalking is something that they can do without too much effort, and it has a huge impact for victims. And victims feel that they can never really get away from what's happening with their stalker, because if it's happening on their phone, you know, they've always got it with them. It's really intrusive. And historically, you know, people just used to be advised, well, you know, change your number, come off social media, that sort of thing. And actually, it's not particularly helpful, because what we find then is that stalkers then just find another way of continuing their behaviour, and what you've got then is a victim who is becoming more isolated, who's changing their life, who's cutting off from family and friends, but actually their stalker just finds a different way of getting in and continuing their behaviour. There are a couple of things on this list that I would make sort of particular mention of. So we there's quite a small number on here around hacking technology and use of tracking devices. That's primarily because victims don't always know that it's happening. We have seen an increase in, you know, what Debbie was referring to, stalkerware apps on phones, people hacking into internet connected devices in people's homes, so Alexa's, Hive, people's CCTV where it's internet connected, those sorts of things, and sort of more sophisticated tracking technology, whereas we used to see trackers that were put underneath people's cars. It's now very much, integrated into people's smart devices. It's on their phones, it's on their iPads. And we would give very much the same advice that Debbie was saying, is that if people have even the faintest suspicion that their devices have been compromised, just to carry on using them as normal. Don't give any indication to the stalker that you are suspicious of it, but don't use that device to get any stalking advice. Don't be using that device to be talking about what's happening, and get some specialist support either from ourselves or the cyber helpline to try to make sure that things can be managed safely. Also, there's a couple of things on here that seem a little bit out of sync with the research that we've seen as well. So sexual assault is very much at the bottom. We think that's because if someone's been sexually assaulted, they don't necessarily contact the stalking helpline. Even if the person who has been stalking, who has sexually assaulted them, has been stalking them, they're much more likely to be contacting Rape Crisis or another specialist service. And the same with revenge porn as well. It happens quite a lot in stalking where it's an ex-partner, but people are more likely to be contacting the revenge porn helpline or knowing that actually it is a offence in itself, and therefore going straight to the police. So can I have the next slide, please? So this is our definition of stalking, and from a legislative point of view, there isn't actually a clear definition within the legislation of what stalking is. So our working definition is around fixated and obsessive behaviour, and it's about behaviour which is unwanted and repetitive. So it's not really about those specific behaviours that stalker is engaging in, but it's much more about their mindset being fixated and obsessive, and it's about the fact that this victim is frightened, they're alarmed, they're distressed by what's going on. So an easy way of remembering it is think 4: fixated, obsessive, unwanted, repetitive. And that's really how we characterise stalking. It's this course of conduct which is impacting the victim significantly. And that's really what the legislation says. It doesn't give us a list of behaviours. It's that course of conduct that is causing distress and having a significant impact. So can I have the next slide, please? There is quite a lot of confusion sometimes between stalking and harassment because the behaviours can be identical, and what we've seen historically is an awful lot of stalking has been mislabelled as harassment. Now the police, the College of Policing, the CPS and ourselves have been doing quite a lot of work around this, and there have been huge improvements around recognising stalking within the police, but we still do see sometimes this sort of grey area where something is labelled as harassment. Like I said, the key difference is the motivation, the obsession that individual has with their victim is what makes it stalking rather than harassment. Can I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that overlap between stalking and domestic abuse. Because when it is an ex-partner or a partner or a family member who is engaging in this behaviour, it can be a little bit confusing about, well, is this domestic abuse? Is it stalking? Is it coercive control? From my point of view, it doesn't necessarily matter which one it's being recognised as long as it's being recognised as one of them, and that individual is being guarded, they're being supported, that all the things are being done to make sure that person is safer. Often what we see is, particularly where there's coercive control going on, stalking is employed as part of that behaviour. So we'll see a lot of stalking behaviours going on while the relationship is enduring, checking up on somebody, following them, finding out where they're going, unwanted repeated contacts while they're out and about, trying to find out what they're doing, trying to get them home, those sorts of things. Generally, the main sort of differentiator is that if the relationship is ongoing, then it's domestic abuse and coercive control. Once the relationship is over, it tends to be more into stalking territory, but it's not an absolute. So can I have the next slide, please? Like I said, the most important things are, is that victim being supported? Is the risk being properly assessed and managed? And is there a specialist involved who can look at domestic abuse and stalking behaviours? So I don't like to get too tied up in sort of where a case belongs from that point of view, as long as that victim is being supported. And what you'll find is if it is an ex-partner who's engaging in the stalking, then still, the MARAC process will be appropriate for managing the risk around that case. So all of the things that Debbie was talking about around the dash, around multi-agency involvement from that point of view, that will still work for stalking where it's an ex-partner. So just follow those same routes. And could I have the next slide, please? So like I said, there's huge overlaps between these three areas. And we are very happy, you know, from our service point of view, we deal with all victims of stalking. It doesn't matter who the relationship, what the relationship is with the stalker, what their level of risk is, or where they are across the UK, they can always contact us. And what we will do is, if it is important that they get some support around domestic abuse and coercive control, we can pull in the right people on there as well. So can we skip ahead 2 slides, please? I'm not going to go too deeply into the impact of stalking, because Debbie covered some of the impact of domestic abuse, and it's very, very similar. What we do see, particularly with stalking, is some very, very significant physical and emotional effects. An awful lot of our clients display symptoms of PTSD. Even if they're never assessed clinically for PTSD or diagnosed, they will have that sort of hypervigilance and hypersensitivity and anxiety that goes along with PTSD. And that's not really surprising when you think about that. Most victims will experience at least 100 reporting that they're being stalked to anybody. Most of our clients contacting us will have been stalked for at least 6 months before they get in touch with us, but we have had clients who have been stalked for 10 or 20 years before they've actually got any support with what's going on. So living with that fear of, what's my stalker going to do next? Where are they going to be next? When are they going to contact me? Who else are they going to contact? You know, what's going to happen? It does make people really hypervigilant, and then that, you know, flows out into other areas of their life as well. And one of the other significant impacts to think about as well is the impact on others and the risk to others. So we see on average about 21 other individuals are either directly contacted by the stalker or very much impacted by the stalker. I've just seen a question there from Charlene. Yes, the person can very much feel like they're being paranoid. It can be really, really difficult for victims when they're being very hypervigilant. They can sometimes tip into feeling that they're being paranoid, and particularly if you've got an ex-partner where there was some coercive control and abuse, and there was a bit of gaslighting going on in that relationship. Victims very much feel like perhaps they can't trust their own perceptions, they can't trust their own judgment of what's happening in situations, and it can become really, really difficult for them. So actually getting the right mental health support for victims of stalking is quite tricky as well, because what we're seeing is that this is usually an ongoing trauma that people are suffering. It's not like it is, you know, a particularly traumatic event that they can then start to unpack and work through with things like CBT, because it tends to be ongoing, and that is a significant issue for getting people the right support. So can I go to the next slide, please, Sarah? So like I said, the majority of victims will suffer at least 100 incidents before going to the police, and that can be for a lot of reasons. So a lot of victims don't recognise the risk that they're at, or they don't recognise what's happening as stalking. Most of our victims who come through to us on the phone will start their conversations with us sort of saying, oh, you know, I don't really want to waste your time, I don't know if this is really stalking, and then they'll go on to describe something that actually is quite a frightening stalking experience. People very much minimise what's happening for them for a variety of reasons. But there's also, you know, a lot of the other usual barriers to getting support as well. If people have had a poor experience previously, or they've made a disclosure previously and they've not got the support that they wanted, they've not been made safer, then that significantly impacts whether or not they're going to make a disclosure again. So can we skip ahead another 2 slides, please, Sarah? So I want to talk a little bit now about what victims need. And from some sort of perspectives, it's reasonably simple for some victims. The biggest thing that we can do to help them is to recognise what's happening to them as stalking. So like I said, a lot of victims don't recognise that actually the behaviours that they're experiencing do constitute stalking. This sort of constant contact, turning up unwantedly, you know, things like sending gifts can be part of stalking behaviour, but an awful lot of people will say to them, oh, well, you know, isn't it nice to be liked? You know, everyone wants to have a secret admirer, those sorts of things, when actually it can be quite frightening. And those very innocuous behaviours can actually be very, very significant red flags of risk. So I don't know if people are familiar with the case of Alice Ruggles. We've worked very closely with her parents and the trust that they set up after her death. But Alice's case was a real sort of classic one. She broke up with her boyfriend. He had been very controlling and quite abusive in their relationship, and that's why she broke up with him. But his behaviours were around that sort of, what almost looked like romantic behaviours, trying to win her back. He would travel down to her flat, he would leave chocolates on the windowsill for her, he would leave her flowers. He was very much trying to reconcile that relationship, and those things weren't recognised as very, very risky, obsessive, fixated behaviour. And ultimately what he did was he came down to her flat one night, he broke in, he waited there and he killed her brutally. And that is something that we see stalking. When you look at homicides of women, stalking precedes about 94% of them. So it's a very, very serious red flag. The other things that stalkers really need is to be taken seriously. There is a significant difference when you look at victims of stalking compared to people who are experiencing domestic abuse and coercive control. Quite often when it gets to a point of stalking, when the relationship's over, when someone's being pursued relentlessly by somebody, they tend to articulate quite clearly, I want this to stop, I don't want anything more to do with this person, I just want this to end. So they might be very frightened, very confused, unsure about what steps can be taken, but they usually are very, very clear that actually they want this to stop, they want this relationship to be completely over, or they want no more contact with this former colleague, this ex-friend, this neighbour, whoever it is who's doing this. They really need specific risk assessment. They need very clear management around the risks that are presented to them. And like I said, they need support to recover psychologically from the experience. So just seeing this question that's come in from Samantha around, so for those if anyone can't see, is stalking behaviour increased for those on the autistic spectrum? Just from past clinical experience, I recall stalkers often had ASD. So actually we do see a slight overrepresentation within some stalking typologies for people who have an ASD diagnosis, but it's only very slight. If people are interested, we do longer training sessions around stalking where we look at the different typologies of stalker, and in particular there's a kind of stalker called the incompetent suitor, and that is where people with ASD tend to be slightly overrepresented. They're the sort of stalkers who are trying to initiate relationships with people, not doing so particularly successfully. And it's really, really interesting actually to see sort of the different personalities that are represented in different typologies. And those sort of incompetent suitors tend to be I am generalising a little bit, they tend to be sort of slightly lower risk and not necessarily the ones that we see sort of further up in terms of their obsession and fixation. I am nearly finished, Jenny, I can see you've popped up. So yes, early intervention is absolutely key. We don't want to wait until we think that a situation is serious. Actually, under the legislation, it can just be 2 incidents that can start to constitute a course of behaviour that is stalking. And even if we're not looking at something that meets a criminal threshold, that doesn't mean there aren't things that we can do to make people safer. So if I can have the next one, please. The last few slides are just about the services that we offer. So like I said, we've got a helpline. We operate by phone and by email, both for victims and friends and family, but also professionals can get in touch. We're really, really happy to hear from professionals who are dealing with cases and they just want a bit of advice or a bit of a sounding board. For people who need some more longer term support, we can provide advocacy. That's particularly around liaising with professionals. We spend a lot of time working with the police and the CPS, helping to build cases and helping to make sure that things are pursued in the right way. We have an online platform as well, so if people want a little bit of interactive advice, a bit of information, they can get that there, and that signposts people then to specialist services. Both we have a specific London service directory, but also nationally. And as I mentioned, we're currently developing a stalking specialist psychological advocacy service, which is a bit of a mouthful, but this is really innovative, and we're working with a clinical psychologist basically to bring together advocacy skills and some therapeutic skills around helping people recover from trauma. So we're launching that in London at the beginning of next year, and hopefully we will be going national shortly after that when we get the funding. So can I have the next slide, please? So yes, there's a little bit more information there about our online platform, and you've got the link. And can I have the next one as well? That's, yeah, again, just a little bit more about our SPA service, which is quite exciting, really, to be doing something that's specifically around meeting mental health needs of people who've been stalked. Can I have the next slide, please? So these next two are just our sort of do's and don'ts, as it were. So our top tips around don't try to mediate with a stalker, don't not take it seriously. Don't think it's less important if there's been no physical violence or threat of violence. Don't tell people to ignore or delete messages, because then we're losing evidence. And don't just tell people to sort of change their number or move or come off social media, because, like I said, stalkers will find a way of getting around those things. And my next slide is just our top safety tips, so our do's. I think my top one on there is always to trust instincts. So if you as a professional think that there's something here that isn't right, go back to what Debbie was saying, really use your professional curiosity around what's happening in this situation. If there's something amiss, then explore that with them. And there's just a few things on there that are our sort of top tips around reviewing personal safety, collecting evidence. But what we really want is people to be getting in touch with a specialist service. So either ourselves, Aurora New Dawn in Hampshire that Debbie mentioned have got stalking advocates, and they have a multi-agency stalking intervention programme in Hampshire as well. But yeah, you can always get in touch with us as a professional, or signpost or refer clients to us. We would be delighted to hear from you. So that is my whistle-stop tour of stalking. I'm very happy. I'm going to stay on for the rest of the session because I'm really interested in what Pete's going to talk about, but I can answer questions in the chat as well. So thank you.
That's brilliant, Claire. Thanks so much. And once again, I'm sure I'm speaking for all of us that I've learnt loads of new things, and also about your organisation. So really helpful for all the practitioners on the call to hear about the sort of support they can get. And thank you for answering any questions that come up in the chat box.